Welcome back to BNC World Headquarters. This year marks 150 years of celebrating Juneteenth, but many Americans are just now learning about this holiday.
Well, filmmaker Roland Wiley did a short documentary that's available on YouTube, and it explains the history. Here's a look at it.
Sometime in the water, sweet Jesus, He carried me. Sometime in the water, sometime in the water.
The Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, officially declaring the freedom of over 3.5 million black slaves. However, news didn't make it as far as people would have originally thought. The American Civil War began on April 12, 1861, and 4 long years later, the Confederacy was defeated at the total cost of 620,000 Union and Confederate soldiers as of June 2, 1865. By the time the war ended in 1865, about 180,000 black men had served as soldiers in the U.S. Army. This was about 10% of the total Union fighting force. About 90,000 were former or contraband slaves from the Confederate States. About half of the rest were from the loyal border states, and the rest were free blacks from the North. 40,000 black soldiers died in the war, 10,000 in battle, and 30,000 from illness or infection. During the war, slavery in Texas was relatively unaffected because the state experienced no large-scale fighting or significant presence of Union troops. Many slave owners from outside the Lone Star State viewed it as a safe haven and moved there with their slaves. After the war came to a close in the spring of 1865, with General Granger's arrival in Galveston to announce that the Civil War had ended, signaled freedom for Texas's 250,000 slaves, they had no idea that their freedom had been secured by the government. On June 19, 1865, General Granger made the following announcement, which read as follows. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Celebrations broke out among newly freed blacks, although emancipation didn't happen overnight for everyone. On plantations, masters had to decide when and how to announce the news or wait for a government agent to arrive. In some cases, slave owners withheld the information until after harvest season. Even in Galveston, the ex-Confederate mayor flouted the army by forcing the freed people back to work. Those who acted on the news did so at their peril. Many men and women were lynched or shot in their attempts to pursue their newfound freedom. In one extreme case, according to Hayes Turner, a former slave named Katie Darling continued working for her mistress another 6 years. According to Darling, her mistress whipped her after the war just like she did before. Hardly the recipe for a celebration, which is what makes the story of Juneteenth all the more remarkable. Defying confusion and delay, terror and violence, the newly freed black men and women of Texas, with the aid of the Freedmen's Bureau, itself delayed from arriving until September 1865, now had a date to rally around. In one of the most inspiring grassroots efforts of the post-Civil War period, they transformed June 19th from a day of unheeded military orders into their own annual rite, Juneteenth, beginning 1 year later in 1866.
Very, very informative. And filmmaker Roland Wiley joined us now via Skype to talk more about Juneteenth. He is in California right now, and we'd like to welcome to BNC Prime. Thank you so much for joining us. We just aired this very interesting documentary Tell us about this. What made you want to make it? Give us some details about it.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's a real honor. I originally made this video back in 2018 for Altanita Baptist Church's Black History Celebration, and I made it for the church, and it was great, and I just decided to post it on YouTube because that just seemed the thing to do, and I left it there. And with everything that's been recently happening, media outlets like yourself and other organizations have reached out to me asking to share it, and even families, even small children, have just been really grateful for this video, and not in my wildest dreams I thought it would have touched people the way it has.
Well, Roland, the one thing I really appreciate about the piece, and it's remarkably well done, is the fact that I personally, and you'll attest to this, Laverne, I don't call it a celebration, Juneteenth, as much as I call it a commemoration, because nothing really ended. It was kind of a piece of paper, but then everything progressed almost as business as usual after that, correct?
And I agree with that, yes. It's because it's that, granted, slaves were free, but it really didn't make a huge change to things. Things still, like you said, continued as usual. And blacks, unfortunately, were still looked at as less than as commodities still. Even though we were considered free, we really were still limited.
It's interesting that you said that children are actually reaching out to you and watching this on YouTube. Do you feel like this Black history there's still not enough of it taught in schools, and children really still don't really understand enough about Black history?
I do. I'm a former educator of 15 years, and that's the main thing that I would teach my students, whether it was in it's part of our history. It's not just exclusively Black history, but it's American history, and it needs to be incorporated into the education of schools everywhere.
I was particularly fascinated by the story of Katie Darling, and there were many stories such as hers. She was free in her body, perhaps, but in her mind, she was not. And she still stayed there for 6 years and still took the abuse. And that was the plight of a lot of Black people who really didn't know what else to do other than slavery. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, that was a common trend, and you could see that in different places, because it's that, okay, now you're free, but now what do you do with that? How do you advance? You've been told, or conditioned, for lack of a better term, that you can't. And now that you can, do you really believe that? And what does that entail?
And what do you think about this generation now? We're seeing a lot of young people out in the streets protesting, teens, early 20s, that kind of thing, Gen Z. What do you think that they have to offer to move things forward? Or what would you like them to know? Or what could you tell them to help them, inspire them, or keep them moving forward?
I am really just proud of the entire movement. And it's important because I've had conversations regarding the phrase of Black Lives Matter, and just peeling back to the history of that is that you think about it, even going back as far as Juneteenth, the life of Black people didn't matter. It's that we were considered as commodities, livestock. Men were bred, so to speak, for just doing work, and women were, unfortunately, when a white plantation owner had a baby who was nursing the child, it was the Black maids. And that's part of that history too. So for the youth right now, I'm really proud of them, and I encourage them to speak out and continue in it, because it's important. We do understand that we are not quite equal yet, and that is an ongoing thing. And I heard, as you were saying earlier, is that I hope that's not just a moment, but a continued movement, and just keeps going.
We understand that we as Black people need to know our history and teach our children that, but how important is it for white folks to understand the real history of what's happened here? We hear all the time. We just ran a story last week about a young woman in Mississippi, a young white woman who her parents had her put in jail because she was associating with Black folks.
Yeah, see, and that's a real hard topic, because it's a hard question to answer in a sense, because there's parts that it involves that community. It involves the white community to be receptive to that, because even the word prejudice stirs up emotions for anyone, black or white. And it's important to acknowledge that we all have a prejudice towards something. It doesn't have to be people. I mean, it could be the weather. The weather could be overcast and gray, and we prejudge it because we feel that it might rain. We don't know. However, back to that main question is that we have to have that conversation, and being, more importantly, receptive to having that conversation.
All right, Roland Wiley, filmmaker, thank you so much for joining us on BNC Prime, and we hope you're working on another film. We assume you are.
I am indeed. Actually, in the turn of all the events, I keep getting more material, and I'm creating another video I'll be posting by the end of the month.
All right, come back and tell us about that one.
Please do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Apple is getting ready to